Thomas Hobbes is one of the most important and consequential philosophers in human history. Some say he is the father of modern philosophy, and with it, the father of liberalism. Quote, "If we may call liberalism that political doctrine which regards as the fundamental facts the rights as distinguished from the duties of man, and which identifies the function of the state with the protection or the safeguarding of those rights instead of duties, we must say that the founder of liberalism was Hobbes." End quote. Regardless of Hobbes's position as the father of modern philosophy and the father of liberalism, he is, without much doubt, the most important figure associated with modern philosophy and its consequences. Hobbes wrote many books, the most important being De Cive, Leviathan, and Behemoth, though most people only remember him for Leviathan, and those that often recollect his name with Leviathan have certainly never read Leviathan. But why is Hobbes so consequential? Why is he so important? To answer the question why Hobbes is so important, we will also be looking at why the Leviathan in particular was so dramatically different from the rest of philosophy, especially political philosophy, before him. While it is a sweeping generalization to state that ancient or classical philosophy concerned itself with teleology, virtue, and the summum bonum, the highest good, the reality is that this generalization of the classics as being concerned with the highest goods in life, with virtue and wisdom, is an accurate one. Except for ancient sophistry, most of the famous classical philosophical schools, be they Platonic, Aristotelian, Ciceronian, Stoic, Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, were all undergirded by a sense of teleology, the summum bonum, as well as virtue and wisdom that human beings were meant to actualize in life. That is, nature has an end, and this end, in various forms, is ontological fulfillment or happiness, principally through love and virtue. Likewise, most of the classical schools considered human beings to be social animals, of course, and there are sweeping consequences from this view when you derive a view of human nature as being social. Humans are naturally communitarian. They seek community. Their lives are enhanced and fulfilled by being members of a community. And humans have duties to community, and executing these duties help to lead a fulfilled life. Needless to say, Hobbes rejects all of this, and modern philosophy, even though again it is a sweeping generalization to say, is principally concerned not with anything that the classic and the classical tradition of philosophy was concerned with, but instead power, materialism, and bodily desire. Throughout the text of Leviathan, Hobbes makes no reference whatsoever to the highest good in life. He merely asserts that humans are pleasure-seeking consumers. Hobbes never associates hedonism with the highest good, something that even ancient Epicureanism did. He simply says that bodily pleasure and stimulation is what all humans share in common with each other. He also explicitly denies any form of teleology in nature. Instead of contemplating and seeking after the good life, Hobbes shifts the trajectory of philosophy and political philosophy from contemplating and seeking the good life to creating and establishing the practical and efficient life. For those who listen to my episode on the birth of modern Enlightenment philosophy, you would have remembered that this is one of the hallmarks and the pillars of modern Enlightenment thinking, the elimination of the contemplative life and the emergence in its place of the practical and pragmatic life. The reason for this shift is generally identified with the rise of the new science. Published in 1620, Francis Bacon's Novum Organum was revolutionary in philosophy. In actuality, Bacon ought to be considered the father of modern philosophy in the more abstract sense than even Hobbes, but Hobbes, of course, is more famous than Bacon. Nevertheless, it is Hobbes drawing from Bacon this same principle and idea. The purpose of life, the purpose of thought, the purpose of existence isn't to contemplate the highest good, it isn't to enter into community with other people, it isn't to discharge duties to others. It is, instead, to establish and create the most pleasurable, practical, and efficient life possible for the self. Hobbes' contributions to philosophy are many, but they all stem logically from his starting premise. Hobbes begins the Leviathan in his introduction and first few chapters by describing man as a sense-perceiving automaton. Man is essentially a machine, a material body capable of senses leading to consumption. He is, as Hobbes himself writes, matter in motion. His only goal is efficient operation, and then from this, everything else flows. Since man is at heart an atomized machine with senses, man is not naturally social as the classical philosophers believed. Speech, as Hobbes describes, comes after the automata has been set in motion. Speech is not really social in its first principle. It doesn't even pre-exist existence. It is just an extension of man's bodily motions, his matter in motion. Speech is the motionary communication of man's thoughts, now verbalized and communicated through sound. Sound is the medium of motion that speech takes when cognitive thought, which is the motion of the mind, is communicated to others. The secondary characteristic of speech is the social implications one derives from it, but it is not essential to speech itself. Speech is fundamentally about the self and not coming into communion with others. Concerning man being a body of mass in motion, unless something else acts upon it, Hobbes defines freedom as the power of movement, the power of motion, the power of exercise. So long as man is in motion, he is free. All men are in motion, hence all men are naturally and equally free. This is how Hobbes can be identified with the liberal tradition. He is asserting that freedom is fundamentally the ability of human beings to act. If you restrict action, you restrict freedom. Rationality and irrationality, Hobbes defines for us, is the principle of regulated and unregulated motion, respectively. Rationality is something that is guiding and aims for something particular, man's consuming animus. In this way, Hobbes here augments the already prevalent Christian idea of reason being an ordering force in one's life that guides desire to its natural teleological end. But instead of the good life and God and ultimate happiness, which reason leads man to, reason in Hobbes guides man's desires simply for basic consumption, bodily pleasure. Irrationality, by contrast, is unregulated motion. This represents that man has no control over his appetites and desires. So again, for Hobbes, rationality is simply the ordering of one's desires, whereas irrationality is letting your desires have control over you. For Hobbes, irrationality defines our state of nature, our original state of existence. It is a brutal field of automata in unregulated, irrational motion, which meets other automata in motion. And this unregulated motion leads to conflict. It is only here that reason, speech, and communication arises and leads to our social aspects, our social life, in order to regulate a way from that life which is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. The ultimate logical consequence of Hobbes's philosophy is the rise of the regulatory and comprehensively expansive state that regulates our lives to prevent violent death, but one that aims, paradoxically, in enhancing human choice, material pleasure, and free movement, as long as in this free movement you don't run into another and cause conflict and violence, so to speak. The end result is the great paradox commentators and philosophers have long observed about political liberalism. In order that humans have rights, they must be separated from one another. In order for humans to flourish, they must be regulated to prevent conflict with each other. In order to be free, which is to have the most choices and ability to freely move, all barriers that restrict choice and free movement must be eliminated. But the elimination of these barriers can lead to conflict and the return of violent death, which is bad because it is unpleasant. Thus, a universal and homogeneous space must be created for individuals to live separated from each other, but given a great deal of consumer options before them, and not be disallowed to move to a new location if they so choose. And again, this is the paradox that many great political philosophers have always seen in liberalism. At one hand, it is trying to create freedom of choice and freedom of movement for people, while at the same time highly regulating and restricting those choice and movements so as not to lead to conflict between individuals. As Hobbes defined freedom in its modern liberal context, liberty or freedom signifies the absence of opposition. By opposition, I mean external impediments of motion. A free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to do. Again, if you read that quote and listen to it carefully from Hobbes, Hobbes identifies liberty or freedom as, quote, the absence of opposition. And again, this is something that is paradoxical about the conflict theory within liberalism. When there is conflict, and conflict is understood to be an abrogation of freedom, the opposition must be eliminated. All opposition must be destroyed in order for freedom to manifest itself. But when opposition comes from another human being, there must be regulation to prevent that conflict, which of course is a creation of opposition. We see then the paradox of freedom in liberal thought, in that it is trying to resolve the tension of freedom of action of many individuals and many people, while trying to also ensure the freedom of action and the freedom of choice for many people. You cannot allow the freedom of action and the freedom of choice to conflict with another person's freedom of action and freedom of choice. Yet this is what happens all the time in society. And this is why it is necessary to have a strong state, a strong Leviathan, and strong laws to regulate our lives. Hobbes's definition of freedom is only one that applies to bodies, and this is very important for us to recognize. Only bodies can be free or unfree. Hobbes's definition is also important for the later development of liberal ideas of freedom and liberty in John Stuart Mill and the entire utilitarian tradition. Mill, building off Hobbes, divided freedom and liberty as meaning two different things, but all still tied to Hobbes's foundational definition. For Mill, freedom is the power to act, while liberty is about not having opposition. This is what Mill states in his famous works on liberty. And yet that is exactly what Hobbes is already saying in the Leviathan. Liberty transitions into freedom once one has the power to act. And this act is purely bodily, purely material. This leads to the dichotomy of positive and negative freedom. Positive freedom being the ability of the self to act, and negative freedom being about having nothing to bind or coerce or oppose the self from being able to act. You can see how Hobbes' definition of the body being in motion is the epitome of freedom, and is, of course, what many of us today have been indoctrinated into. Freedom is simply action, because action is motion, and we are nothing more than matter in motion. The political ramification of Hobbes is that humans are not bound to communities, culture, family, or other such ties, since such things and such ties are barriers to our freedom. We do not have duties to one another. We merely have rights, rights to act. People are purely out for themselves. But since humans are consumeristic machines that seek pleasure, the ultimate end of the political society is not to promote the highest good in life, the contemplative life, the intellectual life, but to create the efficient, practical, and hedonistic life of peaceable consumption. Politics becomes a mathematical equation to solve, something to make efficient and practical, so as to ensure a life of peaceable consumption. This is why, out of Hobbes and the materialistic liberal tradition, you arrive at the politics of capitalism and the politics of socialism. Both are actually trying to achieve the same goal, the same end, which is efficient, practical, hedonistic, pleasurable, and peaceable consumption. The only difference between capitalism and socialism is how they envision arriving at that hedonistic utopia. But all of this can be traced back to Hobbes. For Hobbes, it is from Hobbes that we have the understanding of politics as simply being about the creation of that efficient, practical, pragmatic, hedonistic life of peaceable consumption. And the role of the state is very important in achieving this goal. So what is Hobbes ultimately saying? And again, why is he so important and consequential? Hobbes is really the first formal philosopher to give us a comprehensive outlook of life and politics, based on the premises that man is a sense-perceiving and consuming machine in motion, that all life is reducible to matter. The goal of human life is to live a peaceful, efficient, consumption-oriented life, and the purpose of politics is to guarantee this political hedonism. Politics, therefore, needs to simply be about practical and efficient realities. It is not concerned with morality, it is not concerned with religion, it is simply concerned with mere economics. Whatever constricts one's ability to have maximal choice and movement is also a barrier against freedom. Freedom, then, is about unopposed movement and maximum choice, to do what one wills and to not be limited by other wills. The state of nature leads to a problematic paradox, however. Maximum choice and movement among all persons leads to conflict. In order to avoid conflict, we must regulate some degree of choice and movement so as to not have that war of all against all. The social contract is established to achieve this regulation while still allowing choice and movement, and thus the formation of the Commonwealth, of our politics, a politics which aims at material consumption and political hedonism through a highly regulated but still free and liberty-oriented state. If this sounds like a paradox, you're right. Many people, including liberals who follow in Hobbes' tradition, have recognized this intense paradox. The goal of politics in Hobbes and the liberal tradition simply becomes one of materialism, pleasurable materialism, peaceable materialism, and this is achieved through regulation.